So what do we celebrate in this bicentennial? We celebrate Mendel's birth and what he later did in his research, that when it was read in a new context, it became the foundational document of genetics. However, it is important to explain to people that Mendel was not really doing genetics. He was not a person ahead of his time, understanding what the others failed to understand. What Mendel was doing was very specific, studying the development of hybrids. Nevertheless, his brilliant and ingenious experimental approach, when was considered in an entirely new context several years later, it was co-opted as the foundational document of the science that became known as genetics. So what Mendel offered was a meticulous and diligent experimental approach that really provided the means to study model systems when the new science of genetics became widely studied in universities. Now, the big problem is not how we represent Mendel and his work. The big problem, in my view, is that his name is unfairly associated with a very simplistic model of inheritance that everybody knows about. Everybody has been taught in schools, at least in the Western world. And unfortunately, people are left with that idea that they're genes for traits, which does not help them later in life understand the complexity of heredity and how many different factors, both genetic and environmental, interact during development to produce the outcomes that we see. So, whereas people are looking for explanations in whatever happens to them in terms of disease and their own features, they find hard to reconcile the simplistic model that they have been taught with the realities of life. And as I said, Mendel's name is unfairly related to that because it's clear from his writings, his few writings, that he had a very good understanding of development. And his aim, as he wrote in his paper, was to follow the development of hybrids in subsequent generations. Whereas what we teach students in schools is that he just found out that there are hereditary particles that determine traits, which is not accurate. In order to honor Mendel and his brilliant achievement, which was to develop a meticulous experimental method to study the features and the transmission of features across generations, it is important to clarify what he did and what he did not do. So nowadays we teach Mendelian genetics from a very naive and simplistic perspective. We teach students that there are single genes that determine traits. So we say that Mendel's genes were genes that related to or controlled the color of the seed or the shape of the seed, and that he discovered that there were alleles for one or the other shape, one or the other color. But already in 1915, Thomas Hunt Morgan and his collaborators have explained that this is not at all how things work. Actually, they figured out that many different genes, as many as 25, might be contributing to the development of the eye and Drosophila. And whereas it was true that if one gene, one allele changed, we might end up with a different characteristic, this could never mean that that single allele alone determined the color. So they clearly explained already in 1915 that alleles are difference makers. So many alleles contribute to a trait, and if one of them changes, it might bring about a different result. In the same sense that we can have many different causes for a fire, but it's not the oxygen that causes the fire because it's always there. It's a lit match that can initiate a fire. Now, whereas this was clear already in 1915, nowadays in 2022, we still teach simplistic genetics to students in the sense that, there is this allele that determines that trait and the other allele that determines that trait, which is entirely inaccurate. So, as someone interpreted a talk I gave, should we ban Mendel from schools? No, not at all. Mendel is a great example to show to students how science is done. Is a perfect example of how meticulous, diligent work can provide the context for understanding and studying nature. But we also have to explain what else is necessary for this understanding. We have to show students, and we can use Mendel to show students, that scientific advancement is not linear, that it's done by communities. And of course, whereas individuals make sometimes important contributions, they always rely on predecessors to do that. But we need to stop doing is to teach the simplistic model of naive Mendelian genetics of genes or alleles for. We need to show students the complexities of development, and because development is complex, actually this is what made Thomas Hunt Morgan, whom I mentioned earlier, switch from embryology to genetics, because embryology was too complex. We nevertheless need to give them a sense of the complexity. Whereas now we practically tell students that if you have the recipe, you can cook a meal. What we need to tell them is that who cooks the meal makes a difference. And so if you give me a recipe and you give Jamie Oliver a recipe, I'm sure that you will not get the same meal, because the chef, the cook matters. And it is in this sense that the developmental system matters. And that's why we see that the same DNA sequence in a different context can have a different result. So we need, I think, to teach genetics from a developmental perspective. We need to show that genes do not determine traits, but that they are implicated in development. This does not mean that DNA and genes are not important. They're very important, but they work synergistically with one another and with anything else that is around them to produce phenotypes.